Today we're going over Acts chapter 12 in detail. We read this chapter fully yesterday, so we know that in the first section, Luke is writing about how James was killed by Herod. Then we see that Peter is imprisoned by Herod and then rescued. And then finally in verses 20 through 25, we read about the death of Herod. So chapter 12 is really centered on Herod the king. And we'll see why that's important in the last section. But in the first section, we see that he kills James, the brother of John, with the sword. And Herod is most likely working with the Jewish elites, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are the governing bodies of the Jewish nation. So that's why it's important for Luke to write in verse 3 that when Herod saw that it pleased the Jews, he decided to arrest Peter also, because Herod is trying to gain favor with the local governing body, namely the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the reason that's important is that Herod is actually making more of a power play than anything, it seems, based on historical documents around that same period, trying to keep the Jewish nation at rest instead of what they were used to as a revolting Jewish nation. There were several different leaders that rose up during the time preceding King Herod's reign and after King Herod's reign that were rebellions, or rebels basically, that started rebellions against the Roman kingdom. So moving on to the next section in verses 6 through 19, we see that Peter is imprisoned by Herod, but the night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter was actually sleeping between two soldiers. This is in verse 6. He was bound with chains, and there were sentries guarding the door. And all of a sudden, an angel shows up and says, "Get up quickly." So Peter thinks that this might just be another vision. At first, it says, and then finally, when he's out of the prison, he realizes that it's not actually a vision, it actually happened. So in verse 11, it says, "When Peter came to himself, he said, 'Now I'm sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting.'" So they were expecting him to be killed, to be executed. And so Peter has been saved, and we don't really know why Peter was saved and James wasn't saved. Luke doesn't include that detail, and it could be a number of reasons. It could be that more people were saved through the death of James, and more people would be saved through the life of Peter. So that's just something that we don't know and we can guess on, but we don't know the real reasons. So it's better to take it for what it is and not read our own agendas into the text. So when we see Peter go to the house of Mary in verse 12, their servant Rhoda answers the door, and she doesn't even believe that it could be Peter, but she hears his voice, gets excited. It says, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. So all the people that are at Mary's house say, "You're just making this up. You're out of your mind." And they say, "It's his angel." Peter continues to knock, and then in verse 17, they finally let him in. Peter explains to them how God brought him out of prison. And then he says, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." And then he departed and went to another place. And then it rounds this part of the story off by saying that Herod searched for him, did not find him. And nobody could explain how he got away. So Herod put the sentries to death. And then he went to Caesarea Philippi. And then finally in verses 20 through 25, we see the death of Herod. And the reason that this is important is because the death of Herod is actually documented in several places, several different texts in the ancient world. And we can pinpoint his death to AD 44, which also helps us date this section of Acts, which gives us a good dating system for the entire book of Acts, and in turn, the entire history of the early church. And then finally, to round off this chapter, we read that in verse 24, the word of God increased and multiplied, and we are introduced back to Barnabas and Saul returning from Jerusalem, and also they brought John, whose other name was Mark, with them. So we're going to come to see Barnabas and Saul's part of the church, their journey in chapter 13 and following. So if you can join us tomorrow, we'll read Acts chapter 13. I hope you have a great Thursday, and be sure to be reading Acts and brushing up on your knowledge about the early church. And I will see you guys tomorrow.